Welcome everybody, it is great to have you with us. My name is Lou Richards and I lead the pastoral care team at Christchurch, London. I've been really looking forward to this conversation this evening. It is a really interesting topic that we are discussing, and today I am interviewing and speaking to Dr. Chi-Chi Obuaya. Chi-Chi is a fascinating guy. He is a consultant psychiatrist and he has a private practice on Harley Street, and he also works for the NHS as well. And in his spare time, he also did an MBA. So I am completely in awe. So welcome, Chi-Chi.
Thank you.
So this is a seminar in a series that we have done on the subject of emotional well-being and emotional health. And we did it because pandemic happened, lockdown happened, and we realized that we didn't want to just be in survival mode this whole time, but we wanted to look at how we can thrive at an emotional level, at a psychological level. So we have hosted a number of these seminars on topics like stress, finding joy, we've done one on sex, anxiety, lots of topics like that. And if you are interested, you can find them on our YouTube page if you go to Christchurch London and look at our YouTube page. But tonight we're talking about emotional resilience. Now we're going to be showing a recording of an interview that I did with Chi-Chi a couple of weeks ago. It's really interesting. If you have questions that you want to ask him this evening, please do send them in. You can put them in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, and they will get sent through to me and I can ask your questions. There is no question that is too silly or too small, so please do ask away. In the meantime, I hope you've got a cup of tea or a nice drink with you, and I hope that you enjoy this video. So Chi-Chi, when we talk about emotional resilience, what do we actually mean by that? Is there a definition that you could help us with?
Louisa, there is a definition. I think resilience is quite a complex, multi-layered concept, but a simple definition would be that resilience captures the ability to achieve one's full potential and to develop in the face of adversity. So I think one of the key things, just breaking that down, the obvious thing is that life throws challenges at us. So I think the adversity is something that we can very easily identify with. But it's not just about getting back to where one was. And we use that term, don't we? Bouncing backwards. And actually, there's something about, in spite of really challenging circumstances, not just managing and treading water, but being able to continue to develop and look for opportunities for personal growth. So I think there's something quite aspirational about this concept of resilience, and I'm sure we're going to unpick it a bit further.
That's really interesting because it's not kind of about having head in the clouds looking for a perfect life or expecting that nothing will ever go wrong, but it's about how you cope and develop and thrive in the face of challenging circumstances. And yeah, I guess we can see, or like, I guess all around us, we can see people who have challenging circumstances or have experienced challenges or trauma in the past. Some people seem to bounce back and do quite well, and other people seem to almost be a victim of their circumstances and carry it with them, which is a totally understandable place to be. But I'm wondering what the difference is in the people that seem to get through it and thrive and the people that don't.
What you've described, Louisa, is what I would refer to as developmental trauma. So these are significant adverse psychological experiences that people tend to go through in their developmental years, so childhood and adolescence. The relevance of that is that the brain physiologically is still developing right until our early 20s. And as you and I both know, we're different people to the people we were when we were children and when we were teenagers. There may be some aspects of our character that have remained consistent, but even our ability to interact with the world around us is very different. But one of the key things is that during childhood and adolescence, what we want to do is to have some secure attachments, which help us to develop strong relationships with other people and have a sense of self-identity and security. So when these are challenged, I think that's where people can struggle. And it might be difficulties within one's family, so parental separation and divorce, abuse of all different types. And all these things are very invalidating experiences. So where you expect the environment around you to be safe, that's challenged. And therefore it causes confusion, and it's difficult to then interact with the world in the way that one might rationally expect a person to do. Now, there are lots of different theories around why some people are more resilient than others. I think each of them has their flaws, but it's interesting just to share a little bit about that. One is a so-called inoculation theory, and that's the idea that it's better to have experienced some adversity in the past, and that helps you for the future. But I'd actually argue that particularly people who've suffered abuse, where the normal boundaries in relationships get turned on their head, that doesn't necessarily suggest that adversity sets people up for being more resilient later on. If anything, it makes them much more vulnerable, I would say. Yeah. There's something called an exercise theory, which is the idea that, imagine if you're going up a steep hill, it's better if you've tried going up some gentle hills first. So it's similar to the inoculation theory. A controversial theory is called the intrinsic toughness theory, and that's the idea that some people are just inherently more resilient than others. And whilst there may be an element of truth, I'm not sure how helpful that it is, because that can probably perpetuate myths that people are weak emotionally and not able to handle it. And I don't think that really helps people to find a path forward. And then there's something called the family relationships theory, which is how the family environment does or doesn't prepare us for future challenges. So there's a whole bunch of theory, but I think it's fair to say that some people just have a pretty rough start in life, and that puts them in a more vulnerable position when they face adversity later on in life.
And if someone has experienced a traumatic start or a more challenging childhood, what would you suggest as a way of putting them in the best position to grow in resilience? Would you suggest therapy, or what would you recommend?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all response to that. It would be like asking any of us, how do we cope with adversity? And people may have a whole range of mechanisms. So at one end of the spectrum, it might be having a really close network of friends and family who have that sense of emotional intelligence and you can share things with, and they can support you. I think within the church, that can extend to small groups and trusted prayer partners who can really sit with you in the trenches and support you through difficult experiences. I think as one moves along that spectrum, we would then think about the professional support people might be able to access. So that can include their GP and a range of mental health professionals, including psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. So yes, therapy sits at one end, but I think some people cope with adversity. There's no right or wrong in this. Some people are able to process adverse events on their own. Others may need support from peers who've gone through similar experiences. And that's where that group support can really come in handy in a way that is different to seeing a professional who may not be able to identify with some of those experiences. And it just depends on the individual, what they feel comfortable with, and in some cases, what they may need if we're talking about specific therapies at the more severe end, there are specialist trauma therapies that might help people to overcome the most severe forms of adversity in a safe environment.
That's really helpful. And for the people who wouldn't necessarily say they've experienced trauma, but they may have, may feel like they've escaped from severe trauma, but want to develop their emotional resilience, or may feel like they just need more tools in their toolbox, what kind of thing would you suggest helps build resilience?
Wow, that is a tough question, because I think we need to fully understand what it is that we mean by resilience, and take a step back. If I think about even recent personal experience, I probably thought about resilience in the way that's intimated in the question, which is, how do we strengthen ourselves? One of the pastors at my church does powerlifting for a hobby. He's a picture of health. He's a really strong guy. And he talks about pushing himself to the very edge and sometimes a little bit beyond. And it's that idea, it's almost like the inoculation theory that I talked about. If you've pushed yourself physically, emotionally to a certain limit, maybe it prepares you for future adversity, and that ability to push through. That's the image a lot of people have of resilience. Very recently, I was struck down with COVID-19. I was heavily reliant on support from my family, just for day-to-day activities around the house, and spiritually from my church community, because even things that one would like to do in that situation, like maybe praying a bit more, became quite challenging. So I think there's something moving resilience away from it being an individual pursuit to something that we do within our communities is also really important. And that team aspect is something that is probably underplayed. And I talked about the intrinsic toughness, and it's a double-edged sword, because we want to be tough, but the opposite is that we might feel that we're weak and not resilient enough. And I feel that the burden is too much on the individual. And sometimes there's something powerful, and I experience this, about being vulnerable and having a sense of dependency on others. In other settings, dependency isn't a good thing, but sometimes we support others. Other times we need to rely on others to help us through challenging times. And I think that's often lost in the discussion around resilience.
That's very interesting, because a lot of what I read around the subject of resilience and emotional well-being is kind of individual strategies and tactics, and it's about the individual and their own journey. And I think in our culture, I don't want to overgeneralize, but it feels like we're very independent in our mindset. And I don't know if it's too strong to say we've lost the art of doing community well. Maybe it's not too strong to say. I've been reading lots of articles about loneliness and how many people don't have good friends. And it sounds like what you're saying is that friends and family and community can really help build resilience at an individual level.
Well, you mentioned loneliness, and there's fascinating research about the impact of loneliness on our emotional, physical well-being. It's said that the impact of loneliness is equivalent to smoking, I think, about 5 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
In terms of the impact on our general physical well-being. And we tend to think of loneliness maybe amongst older people, but I think this really challenging period that we're still in a lot of senses, has highlighted how loneliness can affect people across the lifespan. We've seen the challenge of younger people, particularly teenagers, young adults, whose social networks have been disrupted, and the emotional distress they've experienced. I think people who are single, don't have families, maybe live alone, are working at home, that's been another group that have found this particularly challenging. And as you go up through the age groups, loneliness is something that can affect people right through.
It's really sad, isn't it? Like you say, excuse me, that we often attribute loneliness to older people, but actually it's right through.
But you've highlighted the drive towards community, and I'd say that we've seen all aspects, good and bad, of it. I think early in the pandemic, we certainly saw that sense of community, hope, and unity, and people doing acts of kindness, knocking on their neighbours' doors. Pandemics have been studied for their society-wide impact. And so we know that there's that initial sense of unity in a honeymoon period.
Yeah.
But we also know that that's followed by a curve of disillusionment, which has been quite long-standing. We're probably still in it in a lot of senses, where there's distrust of authority figures, people become a little bit more self-focused, and all the anger and frustration comes to bear. So what we need to do in that context is go on this journey of restoration. And I think that speaks to what we've been talking about. Yes, ultimately, there are things people can do for themselves, and we're only responsible for our own behavior. But there is, I think, a need to broaden the narrative to what are we doing as, we can exist in multiple communities, but at community and ultimately at society-wide level, are there things that can be done, or are we at least aware of the context in which we're facing some of these challenges, and understanding why people get frustrated in what might be a seemingly disproportionate fashion.
Yeah. And when we have people around us, say, who we think are struggling in the area of emotional resilience, or that, I've known people who it feels like, and maybe I've done this myself, but it can feel like they're very much feel like the victim, and you want to help them, but they almost don't want to help themselves. Do you have suggestions of how we can help our friends and communities become more resilient? Or is it just being there for them?
It can often feel like a huge burden to support somebody in that situation. I think it's important, if you are in that position, not to be weighed down by the sense of responsibility, and to know the limits of what you might be able to do. There's a concept that we think about in psychiatry and psychology, usually to do with behavioral challenges people might have, so smoking, diet, exercise levels, and addictions. And it's called the cycle of change. And it recognizes that if, for example, I'm a smoker and you tell me, oh, you shouldn't smoke, you've got children, it's bad for the children, that's not going to make me change my behavior. We know this. What you need to do is to show a sense of curiosity. There must be some reasons why I smoke. So if you can approach me in a non-judgmental fashion, understand what my motives are, and just see whether it's one narrative or whether there's actually another part of me that might recognize some problems with that behavior. And you just go on a journey with that person. Now, if I'm ignorant and I don't know that passive smoking is even a problem, what you might need to do is just to, in an encouraging fashion, signpost me towards some information, some facts and figures. What you can't do at that stage, though, is expect me to rapidly change my behavior. You just need to nudge me along.
Yeah.
So I think a similar principle applies, in that you've got to go slowly. You've got to listen rather than trying to come up with solutions. And just understand where the individual is at that point in time, and see if you can nudge them in a certain direction if there are things that you're picking up, particular themes that are emerging. But it has to be a stepwise approach. But you did mention specifically the victim mentality. And I would say that ultimately what one would want to do in that situation is move someone to what we call the power mentality. A good example of this, I used to be trustee of an employment charity, based within the church. And that was one of the things that was explicitly taught, that these were young people who may have had multiple generations of unemployment, they've been excluded from school, they're in situations of poverty and not in education, employment, or training. If one stays in that victim mentality, there are all these external factors which are justifiable reasons for that person not to be pushing on with their life. But the power mentality says that in spite of their circumstances, they have the ability to make something of their lives, to be able to support themselves financially, and then it has an impact on their social networks, their friends, their family. And so that's a good example of resilience in a very practical sense, that by giving them the confidence to tap into a skill set that is there and just shifting the lens a bit, it can actually be quite transformational.
How do we know then if we are playing the victim role in an aspect of our lives? Are there certain things that we might think or say or ruminate over?
Yeah, it's a challenging one, because what I don't want to say is that there are, of course, situations where people go through significant adversity. It may not be their fault.
Yeah.
And so this isn't about playing the blame game at all. To answer the question, I'd say it's going to vary from person to person. And on one level, it's going to depend on one's ability to be introspective. So to look at your situation, take a step back, and actually challenge yourself and say, what are the things that maybe in those scenarios that keep popping up, what are the themes that are emerging? Is it saying something about me? Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think any of us are perfect at doing that. Some people are better than others. So it's probably important to have some trusted people who can give you honest feedback, and with whom you have the sort of relationship where you can disentangle the feedback from the emotion. So that can be really hard, for example, in marriage, because there's so much emotion we bring to those conversations. Of course, in theory, you might regard your partner as your best friend, and you'd want to have that ability. But I think it might depend on the scenario. And I would probably encourage people to have a small number of people. It's almost like a layered network, in that, yes, your spouse or your best friend may sit at the very top. You probably then need a smaller group, maybe 4 or 5, who are a bit closer to the next group below that. And I guess the church again is a model of that, in that you have the disciples, the apostles, and then the wider church, and then you have the global church when you're talking about Jesus's time. So I think we need good people around us who can speak truth to us, in short.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying an element of self-reflection is helpful in building our self-awareness, and therefore potentially becoming more emotionally resilient. But also, what I guess the theme we keep touching on is the power of community and friends. And what would you say to someone who might be watching who just doesn't feel like they have people they can trust or people that they can turn to, and maybe they know that this is a key part of becoming more resilient, but they just are lonely?
I would say to them, don't worry so much about the how you're going to get there. With a lot of these things, and we've talked about the fact that there are different ways of going on this journey, the most important thing is that you're ready to go get on board, and that you're willing to take the steps, willing to be challenged by people, in a way that doesn't make you feel unsafe. That's the key thing. So it's going to be different things for different people. What I'm not saying is that you have to open up to lots of strangers or a large number of people. I think the responsibility is on all of us, though, because it's tough if you feel quite isolated. How do you put yourself forward? And I think it's incumbent on us as a church community to have our eyes open, to be discerning, to be on the lookout for that person who's just on the fringes, who you just get a sense that there's more going on here. So it can't rest solely with the individual to put themselves forward. But I'd encourage people, if you can just have that bit of courage, it can go really far.
And if someone's watching who doesn't normally go to church but likes the idea of the community that comes with church, what would you suggest to them about, or what are your thoughts on how church can be open to everyone and help people?
That's exactly what the church should be doing. We're not perfect, so no one can offer 100% guarantee. But I would say to someone in that situation, put yourself out there, give it a go. Put yourself in a position where you sort of say to people, come get me, I'm here. Start a conversation with me. Let's see where that conversation goes. And I think it's a huge opportunity and it's a huge responsibility for the church to respond in a way that's a little bit different to maybe professional therapy services, because the church can go to different levels, I feel.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd encourage people to give it a go. If it's engaging with things like Alpha or just popping down to a Sunday service, what's the worst that could happen?
True, very true. And if say someone watching has got someone in their life who is struggling and they're not sure at what point they need help, what would you say are the signs that someone needs extra support?
I think the key cutoff that we'd look at is day-to-day living and whether that's being impaired. So what is it that we can do at a high level? If we're adults, we might go to work. So are we able to hold down a job, have good relationships with our colleagues? Yes, we all have our ups and downs, but can one act in a professional manner in that setting? What are relationships like within the family? Of course, it can be complex. There could be multiple reasons why there are difficulties within a family. But putting those factors to one side, are the relationships relatively healthy? Or if they're not healthy, are they at least amicable? Socially, people have different numbers of friends, and some people are not people pleasers or people. But are people able to sustain relationships that are healthy? So I think day-to-day living, so examples of the sorts of red flags one might look out for is someone's becoming very isolated, having not previously been that way. I think when we're thriving, we tend to be quite outward focused. We talked about looking after those around us. That's a good sign. If we're very inward focused and self-centered, not such a good sign. And I think also just striking the balance between focusing on our needs, absorbing information, maintaining friendships. People who are maybe struggling might be consuming media excessively, and that then having an impact on their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth, their self-identity.
That's really helpful. I think the changes to day-to-day living particularly is something that's more measurable than just kind of trying to gauge how well someone is. So that's really helpful. I'm going to change tact slightly we don't have too long left before we do the Q&A, but I want to just ask about, I'm thinking of people who may feel like they're extremely resilient in one area of their life, but in another they're just struggling. So for example, someone could be almost a bit of a workaholic, really achieving well, and they may feel like they're very well regarded and people might see them as very resilient at work. But then they may say struggle in relationships and feel very insecure or something. What are your thoughts there, where someone shows kind of varying levels of resilience in their life?
I think resilience is one of those areas where you need to work on your weaknesses. Maybe within the workplace, for example, there are all theories around this, that actually sometimes it's better to just focus on your strengths and let the weaknesses go. Because if you're working in a team, there's someone else that can pick that up. I think in our personal lives, that doesn't really work. It's often said that our strengths in one area can be weaknesses elsewhere. So the tools that allow you to thrive in one setting may also be the things that hold you back in another. And I think the ideal scenario is to be able to adapt to different scenarios. So you can't use the same approach if you're looking after 50, 60 employees that you will when you're at home with your children. You've got to adapt. And it goes back to this thing of being able to self-reflect, and also take feedback from other people and respond to it.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Last question before we finish this section, and that is just referring earlier to what you talked about when you mentioned vulnerability. And in my expectation or experience is that vulnerability is a newer thing that's become quite popular. Brené Brown and a lot of her research, and it feels like kind of the previous generation was a bit less keen to be vulnerable, and now there's a bit more of an encouragement towards vulnerability of being as a source of strength. To what extent do you think is that true, and how does vulnerability play a part in resilience?
I think it's important that we're talking about vulnerability to the extent that we are. As a psychiatrist, I see people across every walk of life, every sector of working life. And whilst in this country there have been massive efforts to try and reduce the stigma associated with mental health difficulties, it is still there. And I think particularly in the workplace, but not exclusively so, there's a need, or a perception rather, that people shouldn't show weakness. So it may seem that people are banging on about it, but there is a good reason why. And the key thing for me is that it's got to be authentic. Mm-hmm. But when it is, there is something really powerful about someone high up in an organization, if we're just talking about emotional vulnerability, displaying that, talking about it, because it gives people at all levels of that organization, be it a bank, a school, a church, it gives them the permission where they may not have felt it was there. Oh, we don't talk about mental well-being. Oh, right, okay. So the boss is talking about it. The boss is talking through their difficulties, and they're the boss. So maybe I don't need to worry so much about my job security, because the person at the very top of this organization has gone through what I'm going through. And I think it really changes the conversation when senior leaders are vulnerable, but it's got to be authentic.
It's just very hard to do, isn't it? It can feel very exposing.
Yeah.
Deciding to be vulnerable, especially, I guess, if you're in a position of power of some kind. That's
why it should never be forced. Yeah. And I think people also see through when it's not really genuine. And it shouldn't be done for the sake of it. So only if people feel comfortable. There's no obligation to do so, but it's incredibly powerful.
And if you were going to give a couple of just top tips for resilience before we go to the Q&A, what would it be? Just to put you on the spot.
I think going back to what we said, resilience is about things that you can do for yourself, but it's also about doing it in relationship with other people. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. Build a network of people. And whilst you may not see the benefits now, when you're in a sticky situation, that's where that support really comes in handy.
Great. Thank you so much, Chi-Chi.
You're welcome.
I hope that you found that interview helpful. I certainly did. And before we go over to our Q&A, I just want to mention one thing, and that is, Chi-Chi spoke a lot about the power of vulnerability and community and how that helps us become more resilient as people. And you may be thinking, okay, well, how do I go about that? Well, the good news is that we actually run a course that is going to be starting this, well, we've got an introduction session this Thursday. It's called Steps. And Steps is a 12-week course, and it is aimed to help us find freedom from unhelpful thought patterns, behaviours, addictions. So we have people do the course and work on things like anxiety, perfectionism, fear of failure, need for control. And this course is run in a group setting, and it's all confidential. I've done the course 6 times now. I am a massive fan. I've found huge amount of freedom in various areas that I've worked on. And this way, above so many other ways that I have tried, is a really, really good way of connecting with people at an emotional level, being able to share what's going on and work through the 12 steps in a community of other people, completely confidential. If you are at all interested, the information is coming up on the screen. We have an introduction session on Thursday at 1 o'clock and 7:30. I would love you to join me at one of those. It's a really, really great course. And if you're not sure, just come to the intro session. And if you're not keen, that's totally fine. There's no pressure, but it is a really, really great thing to do. You don't need to have a faith background or even believe in God. Totally open to everyone. So we'll hope to see you there. Now for the Q&A, I have lots of questions coming through. If you have questions, please do send them through. I'll try and get through as many as possible. So Chi-Chi, my first question is, and it's kind of related to the vulnerability question, and that is, if someone is really struggling to be vulnerable and just open up to someone else, could you give any practical tips of how they can start becoming more open?
Well, I think the key thing is to start to become more open. What we're not asking people to do is put themselves out there, start telling everybody their life story. In the video, I talked about building a network. And it's almost doing that for a rainy day. What you don't necessarily have to do, everyone's wired differently. Some people are quite introverted and they like to do things in a very solitary fashion. I'm not saying that you have to have 100 people in that network. What I am saying is that we are ultimately made for relationships. And when we're talking about resilience, there are times where no matter what planning we do, we will be dependent on other people. And you probably just need a core of a few people. And those are people that, as you build relationship with them, you can go a bit deeper. And if, for any of us, if we think about our friendships and acquaintances, colleagues, family members, there are different levels. And there's that very, very top tier. If you're in a relationship, that might be your boyfriend, girlfriend, your spouse. And maybe just below that will be your very closest friends. If you're close to family members, they might sit in tier 2 or tier 3. So it's really about those top tiers when we're talking about resilience, the people that you will go a bit further with in developing friendships, where there's often a two-way support system, but this is a process that takes some time. So I think the harsh reality is that we do need to depend on others at times in our lives, and there are times when we're very dependent on others. Other times where we're in that supportive capacity. So I'd want to reassure people that it's a journey, and it's not about just throwing yourself into situations in which you feel uncomfortable or spilling the beans to everybody. It's just about putting yourself out there, being a little bit brave, and just saying, "Here, I'm standing here. Come meet me," and gradually over time building that network.
I like the use of the word gradually. You can take baby steps. Another question we've got is about different cultures and resilience. So do you, in your line of work, have you noticed a difference in terms of how resilient certain cultures are or how it manifests? And what does that look like, and to what extent are these different ways of demonstrating resilience healthy?
Wow, what a question. It's a huge question, and I'd always urge a bit of caution when we talk about culture and anything to do with behavioral health, mental health, and resilience. The reason for that is cultures are not homogenous. Within a culture, there are lots of different subcultures. So to give an example, there may be a particular type of culture in your workplace, but there may be groupings where there are subcultures, and it's sometimes too broad just to assume that people that live within the same geographical area, so a particular country, for example, share the same thought processes, belief systems. So although this has been studied, I just urge caution in saying that one culture is particularly resilient. We can think about examples of that. So you might think about the Jewish culture, and even in the recent past, going back to the Second World War, the genocide and oppression that they went through, that there is a very strong cultural identity. How we then measure resilience in that group, I think, is also difficult. What outcomes show that a group is more or less resilient? And it's interesting I mentioned the Jewish culture, because I think rather than think about it geographically, maybe Judaism is a nuanced example, because there can be sort of non-spiritual element of being Jewish, but I think actually the sort of spiritual side of things is a better way of defining culture rather than thinking about it geographically. I think actually one bad example would be, and with that caveat of not drawing too many generalizations, British culture, where we talk about the stiff upper lip, and that isn't particularly helpful when we're thinking about resilience, because we've just talked about vulnerability, and there is something about the culture we're living in, which is changing, I think, gradually, but that we just sort of brush things under the carpet, or we put our best foot forward and don't talk about those difficulties. I can't think of a specific example, because culture is such a complex concept, of a culture that I would say is more resilient than others.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And like you say, you can't generalize too much, but there's stiff upper lip. That's what a lot of people associate with being British, isn't it? Thank you for that. Thank you. And we've had another question from someone who leads others, and they were wondering, how do you teach resilience to people? So in this case, this person's a teacher, but I guess it could be a manager in an organization, or parent, children. What would you say?
I don't think there are. I'm not going to give any bullet points. There's no manual for resilience, because it is a really broad concept, and it's something that we might do intuitively rather than in a very formulaic sense. So I think an important principle, we've talked about building networks, and one of the key things would be to be prepared to go on that long haul journey with somebody. I guess in the question we're maybe making an assumption that the person being led isn't as resilient as they could be. And I would even take a step back and in journeying with someone and really getting to know them, not making assumptions and understanding what their journey to that point has been. And then you can get a better sense of where you see opportunities for doing things differently. So, Lou, you talked about examples where somebody may not feel comfortable opening up to others. That again is quite a broad situation, and it might be that someone's gone through a very traumatic set of experiences, which mean that they don't open up. So we've got to be careful because it's easy to label someone and just say they don't seem very, very robust. They don't have that fortitude. We've got to understand why. And to my earlier point, I think just being there, being present, and having a defined role will then allow you to understand what is needed. I'm just reading a book by an ex-rugby player called Ed Jackson, and he had a spinal cord injury after a swimming accident and was left quadriplegic. And he, as I'm reading it, he's been in hospital, he's doing all the rehab, and he's got, I talked about those different tiers of people. He's got his fiance, who's by his bedside almost on a daily basis, his parents, some of his rugby mates, the physiotherapists. We've talked about resilience not being an individual pursuit, and he's got this team around him, but they all played slightly different roles. So I think it's about understanding what your individual role is, but getting to know the person better to really see what value you can add.
And in the case where someone is, I guess, in the depths of a depressive episode or struggling with anxiety or another mental health condition, what does it look like to be resilient when you're going through something that is really difficult? Because I guess resiliency in that situation is quite different. Resilience could be, I don't know, I guess instinctively I'm thinking for someone who's in the depths of a depressive episode, resilience could just be, getting out of bed, or
and
putting one foot, what's the phrase, in front of the other.
Yeah. So resilience is quite a broad concept, and I think it has these different elements, and it's important not always to focus on the outcome. I think one of the things that comes to mind when you give those examples is about perseverance. And so we can differentiate perseverance from outcome. When we're outcome focused, it's almost as if we're saying, well, if I do X this number of times, maybe things will improve. Of course, it's natural to want to have that. Or in a church example, if I pray hard enough, surely this will happen. And there is something about just keeping going. I was in church this morning, and we talked about the parable of the persistent widow who just kept plugging away. And it's one of the direct things that Jesus said is not to give up and just to keep praying. So I think, yes, sometimes it's about doing the basics and just adjusting one's goals and having something that is achievable and manageable, but not thinking about the end goal. But I think having a set of tools that allow you to be more persistent and to persevere is one of the key principles when we're thinking about resilience, irrespective of what the circumstances are.
That's helpful. I think there can be a tendency to associate resilience with the outcome. Like the outcome is the measure of how resilient someone is. You're saying that that's not the case necessarily.
Well, one of the definitions of resilience is that ability to continue to grow in adversity. So yes, we would probably want to have a favorable outcome in the end, but it's not waiting, it's not looking back retrospectively and looking at where all the growth was occurring. It's in the midst of it, still being able to change one's perspective and to see progress, to see growth, to express gratitude.
Mm. We've got another question about faith, expressing our faith to people outside of the church, so in a work context. And I'm hoping I'm reading this right. But basically, how I guess as followers of Jesus, a lot of us would feel that some of our resilience comes from having our strong faith. But people outside, people in our workplaces who don't necessarily have a faith may not understand that. So how do we communicate that a key part of resilience is faith? And
I think a few different ways. I think a lot of us in this situation, that there's often a point where actually we have the opportunity to answer that explicitly because people will ask. But the starting point is, I think, trying to be an example and trying to generate that curiosity that there's just something a bit different about you in the way that you go about things, in the way that you view the environment. I think particularly when circumstances are adverse, then we have a lot of opportunities just to demonstrate that there's something that's a bit different about us. That sparks the curiosity. And I think there are those few opportunities. And if we're honest, sometimes we don't take them. Well, I can certainly speak for myself and say that, where people do ask, and you know that the conversation can potentially go in that direction. And I think it's just having the discernment to know where to go. And it's not about necessarily trying to evangelize in the workplace, but just to give an example, maybe the conversation is heading in that direction and you're thinking of something that's happened, and you might just, my wife does this all the time, she'll just say, well, yeah, earlier today when we were at church. So you're telling people that that's something that's important to you, and it's not about, you're not evangelizing by saying that, you're not doing anything offensive, but you're giving them some information about your identity. Now, if they want to maybe come back to that, oh, you remember that time that you said you go to church? I didn't realize you went to church. You can then open up the conversation. So I think there are some clever ways you can do it without causing offense or being worried about the consequences. And it is doable.
Definitely is. And I'm going to be sneaky and throw in one of my own questions. Can you kind of look back on your own life and give us any insight into what has helped you personally become more resilient over the years, in spite of any adversity you may have faced?
I think without knowing it, it's definitely been about team. And the reason I say that is that, to be honest, I always thought about resilience as an individual thing, something I needed to work on to build that strength. Now, if you ask me about my career, I'll happily say that I've had mentors from a young age. I've relied on support from other people. I just didn't necessarily know that that was helping to build my resilience. I saw that as two separate things. So our culture is very much geared towards self-help and being focused on ourselves and what we can do. And so my vision for resilience, there's a pastor at my church who is the picture of health. He's done powerlifting, and I used to think that that's what resilience was. How do I get stronger? How do I push my boundaries? It's absolutely an element of it, but I'm much more interested in, I think, just having the courage to put yourself out there, so that when there are times that you just need a bit of a push, people there around you to do it. Yeah, that's been really, really key for me.
Well, that again comes back to the theme of community and the power of team. So it was also interesting that you were saying that even when you didn't even realise it was building resilience, just having mentors and kind of people walking alongside you. And it's when you look back, you could see that was helping you become more resilient.
Absolutely, because I don't like rejection. I don't like failure. So if I think of examples just in my career, I can think of a few job interviews. And in my mind, when I'm going for a job interview, I can picture myself in the job. I assume that I'm going to get that job when I'm doing the interview, and I get my confidence from that. So even if I am applying for something that maybe isn't a dream job, there's that sense of disappointment when I haven't got it. And I've just, struggled to understand what was going on and why I wasn't selected. And those are the times where, when you've got people that are just your go-to people, it's not everybody. It's not necessarily people that you think are your close friends. They'll just be those people you can pick up the phone to. And I've had those conversations, and just giving you that encouragement as well, which at the time doesn't take away the sadness or the disappointment, but you can just hold on to those words. And so when someone says there's something better around the corner with conviction, that's really, really powerful. Mm. You don't feel it at the time, you don't believe it, but you remember it. And I can think of a few examples where that's happened with me. And yeah, it's really, really helped.
I can also think of many examples of my own. And that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Chi-Chi, thank you so much. It's been so helpful just hearing more about your own journey, but also the whole topic of resilience. Do you have any parting words for us?
Nothing particularly profound, if I'm honest. I think my final thing to say is it's a two-way street. And there are some of us who are maybe givers a bit more, but it's really powerful when it's the other way. And when the boot's on the other foot and you're in need, that's also great. So it's about putting yourself out there and just having that courage to support others, but not be afraid when it's time for you to put your hand up and you need a bit of help. That's absolutely fine as well.
Very true, very true. And on that note, just to remind everyone about our STEPS introduction on Thursday. That is the perfect opportunity to put yourself out there and just try it and see what you think. That is all from us this evening. Thank you so much, Chi-Chi. We look forward to seeing you again in the future, we hope.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.